There we go. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to attend today's lesson learnt lecture. It's our fourth lecture and it will be dealing with complaints, and more specifically, it will give you an insight on how we've made several changes to our complaints policy and procedure to deal with complaints more effectively and share the positive impact this has had on us as a team. Next slide, please, Maria. So, as per previous lessons learnt lectures, there's a pretty standard format. It starts off with the aim. So we are looking to showcase learning opportunities as widely as possible so that it can be applied to our day-to-day work. We want this to be as transparent as possible. So it's an open session. We have, as of today's lessons learnt lecture, opened this up to the public so that residents or people outside of our residents groups can attend, view, listen, comment, question at the end. We will also be making sure that a copy of this presentation is available on our website and via our YouTube channel. We have future sessions booked for lessons learnt lectures in October and November. We are still looking for volunteers for next month, for September and December. We would like to continue these onwards going forward into the new year, as I feel that collectively as a business and as an organisation, there are lots of lessons that we can openly discuss in this kind of format to demonstrate that we are looking to improve and we can do better moving forward. The main point of this, though, is not to name and shame. So therefore, the names of individuals and organisations or even specific teams are not displayed. We feel that this works best so that we can maximise learning potential. Next slide, Maria. So the structure of the presentation is broken down into 4 sections. The story, so there's a basic breakdown of what the complaints team do. The lessons, what changes have been implemented to our complaints policy for both residents and customers. The learning, so what we have learned prior to and from the changes we've made, and how and what we need to do to keep progressing and moving forward. Now, next slide, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Adam, who's going to pick up.
Thanks, James. So the story of complaints. As a complaints team, we're set up to deal with this dissatisfaction with service to provided to residents or customers. It covers over 20,000 properties and approximately 45,000 residents or customers. We as a team deal with not only complaints, but inquiries from MP and councillors, and facilitates compensations awarded to residents' customers following a complaint investigation. We also deal with the administration of all complaints and assist in completing root cause analysis and providing feedback to the various teams within network when things do not go to plan. Next slide, please. The lessons. So the items topics open for discussion in this lessons learnt lecture are moving from a 3 to a 2-stage complaints process, which started in April 2019, updating all relevant policy documents, being more accessible and approachable for all, and adhering to the Housing Ombudsman Service Complaint Handling Code. Next slide, please. So on the change from a 3-stage to a 2-stage complaints procedure, originally the 3-stage complaints process, it was made in April 2019 to move to a 2-stage complaints process from a 3. A 3-stage process was overly lengthy and at times very time consuming. Resident feedback was key in making the change, and the resident customer receives the outcome to their complaint faster and provided their ombudsman rights at the earliest opportunity. The stage 3 process meant there was involvement of various network home staff, including senior members of staff, executive leaders, and also the board members as well. They would review the complaint and the decisions reached at stage 1 and stage 2. Due to the number of people involved, scheduling a stage 3 panel meeting was a challenge in itself, booking the rooms, finding the staff, which often led to lengthy delays before a panel could convene. This ultimately meant that any final decision and ombudsman rights were not necessarily forthcoming in a timely manner, and it could take, after your stage 2 response, 2 to 3 months until you got your panel decision, and then another month after that until you could go to the ombudsman. And residents will always sometimes often unhappy at how long the process was taken once they had been told they were having a panel. So moving to a two-stage process meant that the residents can go through our complaints process, and should they remain dissatisfied, refer their concerns to the Ombudsman quicker. Next slide, please. Senior management intervention is still a valid option if required, as considered on a case-by-case basis. Left it open The Ombudsman left it open to housing associations to decide whether a 2 or 3-stage complaints process works best for them and our residents. And the consensus among most housing associations is that a 2-stage complaints process is the most efficient at dealing with complaints for both residents and customers. It's still worth noting, though, that all stage 2 complaints are overseen by an executive director, Jamie Ratcliffe, and in the event an option to escalate to senior members of staff or executive directors is always available should this be considered an appropriate course of action. We do carry out high-profile meetings scheduled. There's 4 of them a week to discuss cases that need management intervention. And there's regular meetings between the complaints managers of the G15 housing associations take place, usually monthly, to discuss items, including discussing how each housing association handles complaints and why they have opted for a 2 or 3-stage complaints procedure. And the vast majority, 13 out of 15, we believe, use a 2-stage process. Next slide, please. Moving on now to updating all relevant policy documents. Although the current agreement is that all documents will be reviewed at least every 3 years, in the last 12 months, all complaints relevant policy documents have been reviewed and updated, which include the complaints policy, compensation, and the habitual complainants. Moving forward, we are looking to review all documents every 12 months. The complaints team has also assisted in feeding into the review and updating of the ASB policy document and the process and mapping of login and allocated complaints received through our customer contact centre. Old policies, before they were renewed, made process slower, outdated, problematic, and at times not fit for purpose. It is worth adding as well that if any major changes, regulatory or otherwise, pop up, we would undertake an immediate review of the relevant policy documents. And we're also mindful that now residents' customers are able to contact us to complain via various platforms. We've also reviewed the processes in responding to residents who would like to complain via all platforms. And I'll pass back over to James now for the next slide. Who's muted?
Thank you, Adam. You'd think after 18 months we'd know to unmute ourselves. Apologies. In terms of the next item and being more accessible and approachable, various efforts have been made to ensure that residents or customers can raise their concerns in as many formats as possible. By this, I mean that now you can raise complaint via social media, the telephone, by email, the customer online portal, in person, and by post still. We can still accept letters, we still do that. In terms of making sure we are making this, in terms of making sure that we roll this out across the board, there's been additional training and guidance been provided to staff on the front line, and we've updated policy with respect of dealing with complaints coming through on the social media platforms where previously there'd been very little guidance on this. The complaints team has also openly encouraged dialogue between each other so that we can objectively look at complaints and issues that affect residents so that we can offer guidance and support to them. The support itself has been made by way of online blogs, various team meetings, and we also open what's called an open door policy, whereby we encourage those to come through to us if there are any questions or doubts whatsoever to discuss what may or may not be a complaint. We would rather make sure we have a discussion about it than make assumptions and get things wrong. Some of the topics in question are listed overleaf. Next slide, please. So some of the issues that we look at and discuss quite regularly, which may not necessarily automatically fall into the complaints category, are whether or not an issue raised by a resident or customer should actually be considered a complaint or not, whether it falls under our complaints policy or another policy, whether it falls within our jurisdiction or within the jurisdiction of the Ombudsman, whether It's a habitual complaint policy issue, whereby we have residents or customers who at times can be challenging and not necessarily take a final decision on an issue, but at the same time do not wish to take up their opportunity to discuss the matter further with the Ombudsman, but instead continue to contact us regarding the same issue time and time again. We also discuss compensation. Compensation can be a very subjective matter. We do have a policy in place which provides guidance and information as to how compensation should be applied, but there is also very much a discretionary element to compensation, so we're very open and honest and quite frank and happy to have conversations regarding compensation. We deal with MP and council inquiries, as briefly mentioned before. As you can imagine, MP and council inquiries which come through to ourselves can often involve hot topics or topics that are in the press or media, so therefore it is imperative that we are upfront, forthright. We discuss these matters. There's no hiding. Seniors management are very regularly involved with these matters so that we can make sure we not only investigate the issue at hand, we determine what the problem is, how we fix it, and make sure that we learn from those mistakes if any are identified. We discuss Ombudsman assistance. So it's very clear when something goes wrong, a resident can refer their concern to an Ombudsman. That's good. We consider that a reasonable and fair, balanced approach, meaning that we are not self-serving. We have to look at things objectively and honestly, and if at the end of the day, when we've issued our final response, if a resident is not happy with that, they can take their concerns to the Ombudsman. But in addition to that, we can reach out to the Ombudsman to ask for their assistance and feedback and guidance where we may stumble across an issue where we haven't necessarily discussed before, or whether we consider it not necessarily particularly clear and would like some guidance on it. We also provide complaints data, figures on a quarterly basis, weekly basis. We also provide root cause analysis that we can drill down and actually identify where things have gone wrong and look to put them right immediately, but also build in new processes in place so that way we can avoid making the same mistakes again. And again, that leads into learning from mistakes. As part of being more accessible and approachable, we are happy as a team to discuss the above topics, plus anything else that might adversely affect customers or residents. As mentioned before, we have an open door policy, meaning that anybody within Network Homes can ask us to discuss a matter, and we will provide a fair and balanced opinion, which is not self-serving. If we cannot reach a common sense approach, as referred before, we will contact the Ombudsman to see what their opinion on a certain topic is. Personally, I consider being accessible and approachable to be as much a culture change as a process change. There should be no barriers in place to stop a resident from contacting us to raise their concerns. We as an organisation need to be open and honest and approachable in not only discussing complaints, but issues that can affect our residents. We as an organisation should also look to make sure we put things right and learn from our mistakes. We have started to move away from automatically trying to defend our position to taking a more balanced approach and understanding that at times things do not go as planned. But when they do go wrong, we learn from our mistakes, we look to put things right, and as referred before, we look to put in place new processes, new procedures to ensure that if there is any wrongdoing on our fault, we avoid making them same mistakes over and over again. As a team, we're also happy to intervene and de-escalate any flashpoints where required, because we do understand that sometimes a new voice who's willing to listen can make a huge difference. And in an effort to be completely transparent, we disclose all our quarterly information on our complaints. So that's the good, the bad and the ugly, the feedback from the Ombudsman, how well we've responded to complaints, our timeliness on how we respond to complaints. It's all available on our website so that we're transparent and everybody can see the progress we're making. Next slide, please. Now moving on to the next subject, adhering to the Housing Ombudsman Complaint Handling Code. In 2020, following the government's white paper on social housing, the Ombudsman Service introduced plans for a complaint handling code. The complaint handling code sets about explaining the best practices and guidance on how, why and when complaints should be considered. This therefore unified the complaints handling process across housing associations and councils. All housing associations are required or were required to complete a self-certification against a set number of questions and statements, and in doing so adhere to the code. This was required to be completed before the 31st of December 2020. The self-certification covers a wide range of topics and data, but essentially uniforms how a complaint is defined, received, recorded, and how it's investigated, and how the investigation should proceed in terms of timeliness, and how residents can escalate their concerns should they remain dissatisfied with the final outcome. The code also provides clear measures for recording complaints data and documenting why a complaint should not be logged or why we should refuse an escalation to a complaint. If housing associations and councils fail to follow the complaint handling code, the Ombudsman can hand out what's called a complaint handling notice, which we consider would cause serious reputational damage and also damage the trust our residents have in us and the trust they have in us in our ability to investigate a complaint honestly and fairly. Any complaint handling notice handed out are published by the Ombudsman each quarter, so effectively naming and shaming those who have been handed out the notices. And I'm happy to say so far, since going live, we've not had any notices handed out against ourselves. Next slide, please. The complaint handling code went live in January of this year, with any prospective changes made to the policy or process being required to be integrated by the 31st of March this year. Following a full review of the relevant policy documents, as referred before, and in line with the complaint handling code in mind, we completed our self-certification in early December 2020, with all changes made to our policy and process by the end of the year, 31st of December 2020, and well before the 31st of March deadline. Next slide, please. All housing associations are required to complete self-certification in line with the complaint handling code before the end of each calendar year moving forward. So that's the 31st of December each year. We are still waiting to see if the Ombudsman is to provide updated guidance and whether or not this feedback guidance will be updated on a regular basis or as and when needed basis. In terms of moving forward, we've already engaged with our residents panels to see how we can go about involving them in the self-certification process. It's not a requirement, but I feel it's with the experience within the group, it's vitally important that we have the checks and balances in place in completing the self-certification to ensure it doesn't just become a tick box exercise and self-serving. Further discussions regarding this will take place in the next quarterly meeting, which is scheduled for October. We will discuss how resident panel will be involved and to what degree feedback will be fed back through ourselves to the Ombudsman, which I believe is key to ensuring that moving forward, the complaint handling code is well balanced. Next slide, please. So the learning, what we will do. So we will continue to improve on all aspects of communication and take on board feedback and engage with both residents and customers and internally. I cannot underline the fact that I consider communication the key to all of this, the key to making sure that we deal with complaints appropriately in a timely manner, that we get to the heart of the issue, we resolve the matter in hand, and we learn from any mistakes identified. We will continue to follow through with our commitment to our immediate response pledge, which went live on the 1st of June. We will continue with our resident panel meetings every quarter. With that gives us insight to provide or receive feedback from our residents who are directly involved with the day-to-day issues that they face on their own independent schemes or in their own properties themselves. We will take note or continue to take note of resident satisfaction surveys and our Google and public reviews. We will continue with the open door policy. I'll expand on that slightly, but we will continue with that and look to move that forward. And I've put all other means available because I think it's very key to understand and explain that we shouldn't just be limited to these things. We should always be looking to learn, move forward, keep ourselves open and approachable, and make sure that whoever wants to contact us, whether it's a member of the public, whether it's a resident or a customer, whether it's somebody internally, whether it's senior management or somebody on the board, they are able to contact the complaints team to have a discussion about something that's either affecting them directly, that they feel may help breach any gaps that we have in the process, or if they think that things should be dealt with slightly differently. We intend to keep all policies up to date and relevant. As Adam mentioned before, we've changed the process so that we will look to review policy documents which affect complaints every 12 months, opposed to the commitment to do it within every 3 years. We will continue to be compliant with the complaint handling code and the self-certification process. As referred before, we will involve our resident engagement panel to seek feedback and their direct involvement as to how we proceed with that and how we feed back into the Ombudsman regarding the whole process. We will consider and implement best practice guidance and feedback from the Ombudsman immediately. So if they come back to us with a investigation or a decision following a review of our complaint and it impacts us in terms of policy or process, we will do an immediate assessment and update any policy procedure and provide feedback to those involved, and if needs be, wider across the organisation. Next slide, please. We will look to encourage debate within Network Homes. As I referred before, we do have an open door policy. We do already consider and discuss quite a broad range of topics. However, we will be looking to follow through with what's called a complaints roadshow. Effectively, we will be looking to start this shortly, but it will be something where the complaints team sits in on scheduled regular meetings for each team to discuss hot topics or concerns. This will not only give the complaints team a better chance to understand what's going on at a more ground level, but also mean that there will be no excuses to discuss issues with my team. It will also build a better rapport with the individual teams that perhaps aren't in as much contact with the complaints team as others, and it will also help bridge knowledge gaps and raise awareness of the complaints policy and process. Blogs. So the complaints team, we already do some blogs, but they aren't as frequent as I would like, but we will be looking to complete blogs more regularly, which will highlight any change in how we view matters or any change in guidance, procedure or policy, or any hot topics. Lessons learned lectures. We will continue throughout the rest of the year and beyond to promote openness and willingness to listen and make meaningful changes in order to improve how we work and learn from our mistakes, and in doing so better understand our residents' and customers' experience, and ultimately investigate the concerns to the degree expected, honestly, fairly, openly. Next slide, please. Right, that's the end of the discussion. That's the end of the lecture. So if anybody's got any questions. Hi, Gabriel.
Hi, thanks for that presentation, James. Excellent. So two things. One observation to say that over the last 12 months, certainly my perception is that our complaints handling has improved, vastly. And the second thing is, do you think one of the issues, that we had was around the speed of getting information back to you? Has that improved? And I think the speed was always in relation to roles and responsibilities, who was responsible for leading on a particular issue or providing information that spans a number of teams. And I just wanted to check with you from your perspective, has that improved?
Yes, so first and foremost, thank you for the comments regarding the improvement. That's appreciated. Good news is always good. In complaints, we typically just hear about bad news. So good news is fantastic. Thank you. In terms of the responsiveness of information and accepting or sharing responsibility and providing information and feedback to us, it has improved. We have still got a long way to go. Some teams are better than others. Some teams have improved considerably. But it is always going to be something that we are always looking to strive to improve upon, regardless of how well we're doing now. It has improved, as I've said, but but moving forward, we are still looking to improve. We have had various discussions with senior management in terms of people and teams taking responsibility, in particular where there are multiple teams dealing with several different complaint issues. From my perspective, we have one complaint. From various teams' perspective, we have 10 different issues which all need to feed into one specific person. Therefore, things can become convoluted and quite complex, as I'm sure you know. Long story short, it's far better than what it was, but we still have some way to go to get where I'd like to be.
As a follow-up question, James, one of the things that I'm always interested to hear, you know, the nature of complaints, and one of the things we struggled with, you know, historically, was where we were dealing with complex matters. And my perception is that we're getting better at investigating complex issues, particularly around ASB. Is that your perception as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the complex issues tends to be the ones which are borderline, whether we are looking at a complaint or whether it falls under another policy issue which falls outside of the complaints process, such as ASB. ASB is a very hot topic. It always has been, always will be, such as complaints. They are two very distinct issues. Obviously, when we have a resident come through to ourselves and they're unhappy because they've been subject to or claim to be subject to antisocial behaviour, or they're witnessed antisocial behaviour, they tend to come through and want to complain about it. And unfortunately, fortunately, we have a separate policy to deal with antisocial behaviour, which means that it's not dealt with under our complaints policy. There are many issues and facets of dealing with complaints and those who wish to complain as to how we look at things and decide which side of the fence it falls on. Sometimes that fence itself or that line is fairly grey and not necessarily straightforward, so we have to do a lot of digging around, myself and other team leads, to determine where and how we look at this. What I would say is, regardless of whether or not something falls specifically under the complaints banner, we will still have direct involvement in liaising with the resident who wants to complain and the team who's dealing with the issue if it falls outside of the complaints, to ensure there's no breakdown in communication. We still respond in a timely manner. But yeah, it tends to be those technical issues which mean we have more work to do.
Thanks, James. I don't see any other hands up, so can I just ask one more question?
Please, yeah.
Applicable? Hello?
Hello, sorry, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, habitual complainants. Who makes the decision as to whether or not somebody should be placed under that heading?
That's an excellent question, thank you. So habitual complainants is one of the policies that we reviewed towards the end of last year. Effectively, we changed the policy so that there was more resident panel involvement. We felt that, again, this was another good time to make sure that there were checks and balances in place to make sure that anybody we decide to place on the habitual complainants list is done so with checks and balances in place and make sure that any decision isn't self-serving. So ultimately, a manager, department head, whether it's myself or another team, come to me to explain that they have a resident who is borderline a habitual complainant or has too much contact. Their contact with ourselves is disproportionate to the issues they're raising, and therefore potentially detracts from the service that we can offer other residents. So when I receive a report from that through, I drill down into the actual basics of that in terms of how much contact they've had with us. Hello. Sorry, my computer screen. Can anyone hear me still?
Yeah,
we can hear you, but we lost Gabriel.
I think Gabriel's gone. He's dropped out.
Sorry, confused me. I apologise. So in terms of once I receive a report through, we'll drill down into the basics as to actually how much contact that person's had with us, what their concerns are, what their issues are, whether or not they're known to other departments. I will then put together a report which will go over to our residents panel, who will review it and actually have an input or say as to whether or not they feel, yes, this person is actually potentially detracting from the services that we can offer other residents. At that point, assuming we have that response, I would then put together a report which would go over to Helen, which Helen would need to then review, and we'd make a decision as to whether or not that person would be placed on a habitual complainants list. If upon resident panel review there are further discussions to be had. Perhaps the residents panel have alternative suggestions that we can put to the potential habitual resident. If that's the case, we would then work with that resident, because the last thing we want to do is place residents on a habitual complaint list, but sometimes that is the best course of action. So therefore, by way of having the residents panel involvement, we can have those fail-safes, those checks and balances in place, so that we make sure that we look at things objectively rather than just self-servingly. Is there any other questions? Maria, sorry, you've got your hand up.
That's okay. I was just wondering, have you had any feedback from residents about the move from a stage 3 to stage 2 complaint process?
So the feedback, right, so the process took place, the actual change took place in April 2019, and obviously I joined in April 2020. So I haven't had any feedback directly, but as part of looking at this lessons learnt lecture and having spoken to Philip, my predecessor in this role, I am aware that the feedback was positive in terms of it was a far more timely process in ensuring that residents had their complaint reviewed through to a final decision, and therefore being provided with their ombudsman rights, that they can go to the ombudsman and the ombudsman can review their complaint independently and determine whether or not we've assessed the complaint fairly or whether they've found any failures on our part. So the feedback itself has been positive. Adam did touch on the fact that although we have moved from a stage 3 to a stage 2 process, there is still very much elective management oversight. Jamie Ratcliffe has oversight for this, but I know personally that we have high profile meetings. We have 4 of them a week. Helen, Jamie, Michael, all the department heads are very open and approachable in terms of if there is an issue which isn't obvious as to how we resolve it, or there's many facets to it that need to be considered. They're all very approachable, that we can discuss it with them in a very, very open format, usually via Teams, to make sure that we get to the heart of the matter and actually determine what the issue is and reach a fair outcome for the resident. Hi Gabriel, you're back.
Yeah, was that me? Did I just disappear, or did everybody disappear?
Yeah, just you. Yeah, I did panic. I
just
thought
you.
my internet dropping out. Yeah, you panicked. Sorry,
It's a
I panicked.
conspiracy.
I did answer your question.
Okay.
Would you like me to go over it for you?
No, that's okay. I'll listen to the recording, don't worry.
Okay, Helen, you've got your hand up.
Hi, James. I just wanted to ask your view, and indeed anybody else on the call, about issues that are presenting as extremely urgent when they come in as a complaint, and whether you have a kind of triage process, don't you? And I think most of the time it works really well, but there have been odd occasions where something has come in which we've put into the complaints process and said we'll reply in 10 days when it's something that really needs an immediate response, to coin a phrase. How do we deal with those?
Yeah, absolutely. So you are right. That has happened in the past. What we now have, and this coincided with working remotely because it works very well, is that we now have Teams chats specifically for each relevant department, especially those we deal with regularly. So as and when anything urgent pops up, it's literally the case of sending over a Teams message. Invariably, it's usually to our repairs team or neighbourhood team. There we can escalate things immediately and actually get the ball rolling. The department heads or the team leads for those specific teams are very aware of what is to be considered urgent and we need an immediate action or response, and or what is something that needs investigating, and we can not take the time, but we have more time to deal with those specific issues.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I suppose just sorry, now I'll step back. Jackie's got her hand up.
Go ahead, Jackie. You're on mute, Jackie.
That's it. That's it. Lesson 1. Turn the microphone on. So first of all, it was really feedback and an observation, and I have to say a massive thank you to you and your team, because I think what we've experienced, we've had a number of kind of complex complaints to deal with, and the support that we've received from your team has really helped. And I know I mean, you'll know that there's been some frustrations within the team as to why perhaps we're responding to some of the like multifaceted complaints. But actually, I think your reasoning and your rationalisation helps everyone to focus on, you know, ultimately getting the right response back to the customer. The other thing is, actually, I think I really welcome the opportunity for you to join our team meetings from time to time, because I think one of the bits that we're missing is the detail learning. So the learning that's relevant to the specific team. So for argument's sake, in the neighbourhood teams, I think sometimes, you know, when you're so close to it, it would be nice to have that opportunity maybe to pick a complaint out and discuss it with you guys to help us think through, you know, how we can avoid getting into that situation again where perhaps the customer's been dissatisfied with our approach. So I think going forward, it'd be great if you know, to have you join us even just for 10-15 minutes, and perhaps we can identify some complaints and have a conversation around that. Obviously, when we respond, we try to pick out the learning, but I think it's just having a discussion in a team forum, because quite often it's managers that are dealing with the responses. So we'd welcome that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we plan to do as part of our Complaints Roadshow, but also I've discussed it fairly recently with Jamie, who's my manager and ultimately responsible for the complaints team, in terms of refresher training and just sitting in teams, just to, like you said, go over perhaps the bits and pieces, the finite things which actually very specific to a team, which aren't necessarily obvious. That includes going through Customer Hub, which for those external people attending is our sort of internal systems, how we actually go about logging complaints, moving things on, closing them down, adding our complaint responses. They're all things that most people assume people can do, but in real life, we get emails every single day asking us to close complaints because people aren't sure or unsure as to how to do it. So it's something that we are discussing and we will roll out. Obviously, there's quite a number of teams, so it's probably going to be the case that we perhaps do refresher training, and then those who feel they need it, we actually do more one-on-one training with the specific teams. But again, that'll kind of feed in on the back of our complaints roadshow that we want to do, where we'll cover more broad topics that are hot topics and more sort of far-reaching issues and ideas that we have that we'd like to take forward to improve the complaints process again moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Helen, you said did you want to come back in before Paul, or?
I think you partly covered it, actually. I was wondering about the use of analysis and trends, because one of the things that I've found in my many years doing this job is that all of a sudden, or it will seem all of a sudden, you'll start to receive a lot of complaints about a particular topic. And I've always used that as a sort of temperature test. You know, if I haven't had any tests about complaints about leaking balconies for the previous 10 years and all of a sudden I start to get them, then that tells me something is going wrong systemically in the organisation. Do you think we do enough to communicate that sort of trend and analysis, or is it something we're working on further? In
short, no, but it is something we are trying to work on. So at the moment, all our complaints data is recorded through Customer Hub, because Power BI has been, we've tested it and tried it, and we cannot get the data to be reliable. Now, when we record on Customer Hub, we only list the main complaint, not all issues raised. So therefore, if we were to do a drill down or root cause analysis for the main trends, it wouldn't be any way accurate. It limits our analysis, yeah. But we are working on that. I think we've had 3 different attempts and we got fairly close in the last one. I don't know when the next attempt is going to be, but it's something that we're keen to work on, because I am very aware that the quarterly reports we do, I think we can be doing more. I think we can drill down more. I think we can provide more data, and in turn that will help us with our learnings. It's very easy to say we want to learn from our mistakes, but we can only do that if we can identify the mistakes. Now, we can do that on a case-by-case basis, especially if something's gone really wrong, quite easily. But it's the smaller things, the smaller tweaks that perhaps are floating under the radar because we can't identify them, I think, where we can make slight tweaks which could make a real difference on the ground. I think it's worth noting also that in terms of trends that come through all of a sudden, the majority of our complaints come through from repairs. I think it's around about 60%, and I've said this fairly recently in another meeting. about 60% of our complaints come through our repairs related, but that's still probably less than 1% of the, I think, 65 odd thousand repairs that were completed in the last year. And also repairs are very much subject to weather. So obviously in the winter we have considerable amount of complaints about leaks or breaking down boilers compared to the summer. And in the summer we have air conditioning or overheating in buildings, and obviously we have expansion and other issues at different times of the year. But I think that's stuff that we can all factor in, and we can actually project or propose what we like to receive based upon what we've seen in the previous years, and therefore make an action plan and put in place ideas we can have in anticipation of those issues coming forward.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, been waiting a while.
Yeah, no problem at all. I think what you're saying about the road shows and getting, we've got to a stage, I think, where we respond to complaints, but not with the right detail. Yeah. So we need to get the proper detail in there. We say, oh, very sorry for your leak. We are going to rectify it on the 25th. I think I'm probably thinking more from my side in voids and lettings, where we need to go in deeper and deeper and deeper. I know myself, you and Adam, we work very closely together, and David as well, in the complaints team, because the complaints about housing they're increasing week on week, month on month. So yeah, I think it would be really good to have another sort of a briefing about what you require, so it doesn't go to that next stage, so we get everything in there. I don't know about every other team. All I can see is a couple of responses that my team have given haven't been the best. They haven't had the best detail in there. But what else can we do? Can we get a sort of a template of what we should be including in our responses?
Yeah, but, so that, sorry, go ahead. So that's a fair comment, and that's something that we will be looking at both on a individual basis, and it will be something that we discuss in the roadshow. This, to varying different degrees, happens with all teams. Some teams provide everything in the kitchen sink, perhaps a bit too much detail that makes the letter far too long. Residents might become disengaged by the letter because it's considerable. Some just do not provide enough detail before. I know you and I have had the conversation about this fairly recently. Yes. So it's very much dependent upon what the complaint point is, and obviously what investigations taking place, and ultimately what our resolution is going to be. But essentially we should be able to demonstrate that we've understood the complaint, we demonstrate that we've investigated it, and we demonstrate that we're going to put it right on a specific date, and then follow that up with, if this doesn't happen, please contact me, or if this doesn't happen, you may escalate to stage 2 or onwards to the ombudsman, or XYZ. I think it's just a case of being, it is a case of each letter is judged on its own merits depending on what the complaint is, but I think there is a very set of broad criteria, basic criteria that we should be covering off in each response, and we will make sure that we go through that whenever we start doing our complaints roadshow.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Right, I've got Kirsty and Amanda. I'm not sure who was first. I actually think it was Amanda. So Amanda.
Hello, hi. This has all been very much about process, hasn't it? I think, and learning about the process. I must confess, I was expecting something more specific, as Jackie was referring to, about drilling down into the detail of what went wrong with something, so you learn from a kind of real life example. But one of the things I wanted to ask was, where does the complaints team get involved in actually checking that the promised resolution has actually been achieved? Or does the complaints team role kind of end with the letters have gone out, the logs are completed, the response time has been met, etc.? Because I feel that sometimes, we write letters and promise stuff but don't actually necessarily deliver. Okay,
so first of all, in terms of being more specific and drilling down, because of the way that the lessons learnt lectures were decided, it was made clear that we shouldn't be naming and shaming people's departments. So therefore we've avoided actually looking at specific complaints. It is something that we are actually looking at to see if we can look at some more general stuff surrounding issues that are repeat issues. but it's something that, despite something that sounds fairly straightforward and easy to do, actually isn't, without actually naming and shaming departments, and therefore being able to link it back to specific people within teams. Where we've identified those issues, feedback will have been provided to their team leads so that additional feedback training can be provided, so that ideally going forward we don't see those issues again. In terms of, sorry, what was the second part of your question?
About following through that stuff actually gets done.
Yeah, so this is something that we as a team are looking to improve on. I think we're all responsible for this, not just my team. It's part of our immediate response and making sure that we not only provide immediate response, but it's also a meaningful response, and we follow through and honour our agreements and our commitments. So if we make a promise to contact a resident within 10 days, we have to do that. If we make a promise to investigate something a little further outside of what we usually do, we commit to doing that. In terms of following things up once a stage 2 complaint has gone out, usually we've reached the decision where we've kind of met the end of the line. There are instances where, for example, a repair is outstanding, but we consider that we've got it scheduled in for X, Y, Z date, and we've discussed it with the repairs team, and they feel that they have everything best placed to actually deal with the repair and get it resolved. If the resident then comes back to us to say it's not been resolved, and obviously we look to escalate it, but we wouldn't actively check on that ourselves and then follow it up with the residents. Unfortunately, we just don't have the manpower or time to do that. What I would say is that, though, for this specific example, and sorry to pick on repairs would follow that through and check up. They have feedback and contact with their contractors very regularly, so if things don't go to plan, they're normally made aware of it almost straight away, which normally means if it's a high profile case, I'll be made aware of it straight away, and means that we can proactively contact the resident and discuss things before they contact us. But for the most part, it is, we've reached the end of the line, we have an ideal resolution in place, we assume that's to take place, and go ahead as planned, unless advised otherwise. Kirsty, I think you were next.
Yeah, mine was just more around the discussions that are kind of already being had. So off the back of Amanda, what you said in regards to following up on promises made, and Dion saying about sharing best practice, I think everybody has their own way of trying to make sure that the promises we've made are followed up. But for example, in our team, we would log ourselves, once the complaint's been closed down, we log ourselves a new customer hub case to make sure that that doesn't forget to be monitored. So things like that people can consider doing to keep on top of them once the response has been sent out. But also regarding the conversation about root causes, while the central should definitely play a part, I also think that each team should take ownership to do trend analysis on their complaints to understand that and what can be done in terms of processes internally. So we have like a root cause tracker for our complaints, and if we see multiple complaints about the same topic, such as roofing, we have to be reactive to it. And even though it could be connected to the weather conditions, like James quite rightly said, it doesn't necessarily mean we should just leave it how it is. So we have to try and identify whether we're able to cope with that influx, what we can do as a short-term solution to get us out of the problem, and how we can better prepare next time. So I think having data like that individually in each team would be really useful in terms of taking a more proactive approach to the complaints.
I think Kirsty's right exactly in what she's saying. We need to find out the root cause of these complaints, where it might be roofs, fences, brickwork, leaks. Why are we not doing anything more previously as a business, as a housing provider, to actually do this as a cyclical program? Because that's what's causing this in the original problem.
Yeah, I do completely agree with that. I think perhaps that's a different discussion for another time, but
most definitely, yeah, totally agree, James.
I completely agree with what you've said as well, Kirsty. Ms. Quintaro, you have your hand up and you're on mute at the moment, by the way.
Yes, I know that it has been said and also suggested that there will be training, internal training, but I think consistency across the board will be a very good thing because if some teams deal with things differently to others, then the inconsistency can create bigger problems. And the other suggestion, if I may make, is that try to solve problems internally rather than having to customers being or residents being so unhappy that they go somewhere else. I think trying to deal with it internally will save money, time, and residents are happier in the lives as well, because if you don't have to be sitting on the phone constantly or sending letters and this and that. So I know that this somebody also mentioned as well the fact that to set up something, and I think it was Helen who said, she asked the question about dealing with issues that need dealing immediately, like a leaking roof or a tap that's running or something like that. So to set up some kind of an emergency dealing with, rather than the person having to be calling. I know that one of the resident panels have had an issue for like 2 years. With water leaking from gutters, fences on the floor, and she went to the point where she was in desperation, and I don't think it should have gone to that point. 2 years dealing with this, I think that's too long. I'm not sure what the result was for her, because she apparently was sent a letter saying they were going to deal with it. But anyway, just as a suggestion to be more consistent and to try to deal with things more internally than to having to send you away to do something else.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. In terms of more consistency, we've kind of demonstrated in the last 12 to 18 months that if we provide additional training, we can be more consistent with our approach, because the fact we've had to move most things online in terms of whether it's by Teams, email, over the telephone, opposed to in person, and there's been less day-to-day interaction with our residents. Additional training has been provided to the frontline staff in terms of how they deal with things via a customer contact centre. I know personally my team, we've had to change the way we work slightly, working from home, having to use Teams. I think with additional training, with the road shows, with the one-on-one training, we can provide more consistency with complaints, how we deal with complaints, how we identify complaints correctly and in a timely manner. The issues which fall outside of the complaints, how we communicate that to a resident. I think there's certainly work to be done. We can definitely do that. By no means are we anywhere close to what I'd like us to be. So I take your point on board. In terms of the dealing with things internally and satisfactorily, I understand what you're saying. We are always obviously looking to make sure we balance our needs as a housing association with the problems that we've identified and with the issues that residents have raised with us. We have to do that with a fair and balanced approach. We have to make sure that we have the resident in our mind and heart of everything we do. And we have to have those checks and balances in place to make sure that we assess things correctly, identify where there's been any failures and make sure we put them right and learn from them. Again, that's not a process that can be done overnight. We have made inroads into it and we'll continue to learn. Part of that will be these complaint roadshows, will be the additional learning, will be picking up things via the open door policy that we have. We'll be making sure that we check in with people. We do quality checks on people's response letters, making sure we explain in a bit more detail what kind of response is required, so there's sufficient detail so that the resident understands fully that we've investigated the complaint, how we've investigated it, how we've reached our decision, even if you don't necessarily agree with it. I think they're all very key things to consider. In terms of the very specific issue raised, I understand it's regarding a resident panel member. I know the panel member in question. I phoned them personally myself to discuss the issues. This perhaps isn't the right forum to be discussing that specific issue, but it is underhand. Sorry, it is in hand.
Sorry, I was just putting it as an example of things taking point
so where those specific issues have been picked up, they've been discussed by senior management. We are in the process of putting some of those issues right. Some of those issues do fall outside of the complaints process, so I want to be transparent about that. But that said, I have been heavily involved with making sure we look to put things right. Some of those issues have been going on for a considerable amount of time, but it's not that we haven't been dealing with those issues. It's because those issues have been almost one issue consecutively after another and slightly different issues, but from the outside looking in, they look as though we just haven't done anything for a number of years, when in actual fact it isn't totally correct. But again, just to reiterate,
I just by information given. So sorry, but thank you for your answer.
Yeah. You're welcome. Anyone else got their hand up? Sorry, Maria. Sorry.
Thank you. So just thinking about something that Amanda said a little while ago, where she said that she thought that the session was going to be about a specific issue that had arisen and lessons that we learned from that. And I totally get what you were saying, James, about not wanting to particularly like name and shame other teams. However, I was thinking that if other teams were interested in looking at something that they felt themselves they could learn lessons from, if they were happy to share a particular instance, and this is kind of just a shout out for future sessions, I think that would be welcomed.
Absolutely. So this is, I sent around an email week before last to our elected team and our senior management team to seek feedback from their teams beneath them to see if there's anybody who's willing to step forward to either do a lessons learned lecture themselves, or whether they're willing to be a topic that I will drill down in and deliver myself in terms of a complaint which went wrong, or an issue which went wrong for a specific team, which evolved into a complaint which was dealt through my team, and then perhaps even went on to the Ombudsman and they provided determination. As referred right at the very start of the presentation, we do have lessons learned lectures set up for October and November. They're with our customer services team and with our M&E and mechanical and electric team. We are looking for volunteers for September and December and throughout the next year, because we do want to continue these going and do feel it's beneficial, and that we will continue to be as transparent as possible, engage with the residents. We've had a fairly small take up in terms of external people attending the meeting today or the presentation today. I would like to see more people externally attending than we have internally, because I think we'd then be able to have a far better gauge on how well we're doing and how well this kind of presentation is received, and it might even give us a steer as to what we need to look at next. Has anybody else got any questions? Okay, right. I would like to thank you all then. Sorry, Ines, do you want to come back in? No, sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that I didn't want to discuss anybody's case in particular. I was just illustrating my point. But the other thing I wanted to say is that, like, sometimes people are very quick to, you know, like take a more holistic approach to somebody's case, because sometimes cases vary, as well, I'm sure they do all the time. And it's just looking at cases more sort of where they come from and what is really happening, how is affecting them, these problems, because sometimes they can affect people in quite deep ways. So I know that maybe you say you don't have the time to deal with each individual, like spend months on, but if you have a good team, maybe, you know, that everyone will take. And anyway, thanks so much for the discussion.
That's okay, Ines, and thank you. I appreciate your comments. I take on board your comments as well. It's something that we're continuing to work on. In terms of a holistic approach, we do have a complaints policy which limits usually what we can and will look at in terms of a time frame. That said, I do think we do need to use a common sense approach to a certain degree, and we can at times look beyond it. But it is done on a case-by-case basis, so we just need to keep an open mind to that. But we don't necessarily write things off immediately just because they're outside of 6 months. Any questions from anybody else?
Thank you.
No, I just want to say thank you, James, Adam.
You're welcome.
Really good.
And, Paul, I hope you continue to recover. Okay, I'm here if you need anything.
Yeah. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks, James. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right. Thank you all.
Bye.
Today.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.